now that you've watched the video, let's go through these examples. So, which of these is going to be counted in gross domestic product? In order to be counted, it has to be a final good or service produced within the calendar year of the calculation, and it has to be sold to a consumer. So the government has to be able to observe this sale. So a visit to a doctor would count. Sale of a used car would not count because the car was not produced within the time period we're measuring. Vacuuming your rug at home would also not count because there's no sale. There's nothing that has been exchanged between a producer and a consumer. Now, this activity is productive. So we call this kind of an activity household production. And this is actually one of the limitations of GDP, that we can't include household production. When you vacuum your rug at home, it doesn't count towards GDP, but if you hire a cleaning service to come vacuum your rug, it would count towards GDP. Because the government can't observe household production, it can't be included in GDP. Ideally, we would like to include it because those productive activities are part of our aggregate production. All right, so burrito, definitely gonna count. Haircut will count. Cheese from Italy will not count because we're measuring US GDP, but jeans from Kentucky will count. Now we're kind of getting a sense of what types of things go into our GDP calculation and what types of things are left out. But what does it matter? Why do we care about aggregate production? Well, we care about aggregate production primarily because we care about aggregate income. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to understand when we are measuring what's going on in the economy is what is the reality in terms of standard of living or quality of life for people in a country, in a state, in a city. That's what we're trying to get at here. And so because aggregate production is equal to aggregate income, then this measure gives us some sense of the quality of life of people living in a certain area. When we have a lot of production, we're producing a lot of stuff, that stuff has value, people are going to sell that stuff, and in the aggregate, total expenditures is equal to total income. So everything that's being sold has a buyer and a seller. And so aggregate expenditures, total expenditures, is going to be equal to total income. So what we really care about when we're measuring aggregate production is to try to get some sense of not just how much is being produced in this country, but how much is being created, how much value is being created, because that gives us a sense of how much we can consume. So GDP is an imperfect measure of aggregate production, certainly, and therefore an imperfect measure of aggregate income for a lot of different reasons, because there's a lot of things that don't get included in GDP. One of them we've mentioned already, and that's household production. You maybe cook dinner for yourself, that value of that productive activity is not included in GDP. So the GDP numbers are going to underestimate the value of our production, particularly in cases where we have a lot of people working at home, taking care of children or elderly parents, when we have a lot of people working in the informal sector, under the radar, right? In some countries, we have large informal sectors of the economy, and that's going to affect their GDP numbers. So it's important to recognize that we can't include in GDP anything that we don't observe, that the government doesn't observe. Not included in GDP as well are other things that have value to us, like environmental production And that means that GDP doesn't reflect all of the things that we value. So GDP is a really limited measure, not only of aggregate production, but of well-being as a whole. And so we have lots of different ways to measure well-being, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the discussion about long-run economic growth.